When we think of the people who built Australia, who comes to mind? We might think of the explorers in their ships, or the stoic farmers and squatters pushing out into the bush. We picture strong, hard men. But what about the women? What about the founding mothers of this nation? For this nation, I'm not talking about the governor's wife in her fine silks. I'm talking about the ones who had no choice, the ones who arrived not with hope and possessions, but in chains. They were convicts, just like the men, but their story is different. It's a story of facing not just the hardship of a new land, but the added burden of being a woman in a brutal, male-dominated penal colony. It's a yarn about unbelievable grit and a resilience that is, perhaps, the most powerful and overlooked part of our national story. Let's meet a young woman we'll call Eleanor. She's not from the slums of London, but from the crowded, rain-slicked streets of Dublin. In the late 1700s, Ireland was a place of deep poverty and turmoil. Ireland was a place of deep poverty. For a young woman with no family and no prospects, life was a tightrope walk over a pit of desperation. Eleanor's crime wasn't grand. She didn't plot against the crown or led a rebellion. She stole a few yards of lace from a wealthy merchant's shop. Perhaps she hoped to sell it for food, or maybe, just for a fleeting moment, she wanted to own something beautiful in a life that was anything but. The law didn't care about her reasons. She was caught, and in a courtroom full of men who saw her not as a person but as a problem, she was sentenced to 7 years transportation to New South Wales. A place she had only ever heard of in hushed, terrified whispers. The voyage for a female convict was a special kind of hell. The women were crammed below deck in even more confined spaces than the men. Sickness was rampant, but there was another danger, a constant, creeping threat. On a ship, her survival often depended on her wits, her toughness, or making a grim choice to accept the protection of one of the ship's officers in return for small favors, a little extra food, a bit of privacy. You have to wonder how a young woman survived that. Not just the storms and the sickness, but the constant, looming threat from the men around her, day after day, for 8 long months. The only solace was the bond forged with the other women, a sisterhood of the damned, sharing stories, watching each other's backs, and holding on to the faintest sliver of hope in the suffocating darkness. When the ship finally dropped anchor in Sydney Cove, there was no sigh of relief. No sigh of relief. For Eleanor and the other women, the ordeal was just beginning. They weren't set free. They were marched from the ship and taken to what was known as the female factory at Parramatta. It was called a factory, but for many of the women who passed through its gates, it was just another prison. Who passed through its gates, it was just another prison. It was part workhouse, part barracks, and, most cruelly, part marriage market. Here, the women were sorted and classified. Those with useful skills like sewing or laundering were put to work. The others were left waiting, their fate to be decided by men they'd never met. To be decided by men they'd never met. Settlers, soldiers, and emancipists could come to the factory to apply for a female servant or a wife. Imagine the terror and the hope of that moment. Standing in a line while men walked past, inspecting you like livestock. Would this man be a kind master, a future husband who might offer a real life? Or would he be just another tormentor, a man who saw you as nothing more than his property to be used and abused at his whim. Eleanor's fate was decided by a red-faced officer who needed a house servant. She was assigned to him, leaving the relative safety of the other women for a small, isolated hut on the edge of the settlement. Her life was entirely in his hands. Her work was from sunup to sundown, cooking, cleaning, mending his uniforms, all under his watchful, often predatory eye. This was the reality for thousands of convict women. They were a tiny minority in a colony, teeming with men, a fact that made them both incredibly vulnerable and, paradoxically, a valuable commodity. But Eleanor, like so many others, was a survivor. She was more than just a victim of the system. She was smart. She learned to navigate her new life, to be useful, to make herself indispensable. She learned to endure the officer's rough advances and unpredictable temper. And in her few stolen moments of freedom, she began to form a life of her own. She met other emancipists, men and women who, like her, were trying to build a life from the ashes of their old one. And that's how she met Thomas. He was an emancipist himself, a quiet, hard-working man with kind eyes who had his own small farm. He didn't look at her the way other men did. Men did. He didn't see a servant or a potential wife to be had. He saw a person. He saw the strength and the fire in her that she thought had been extinguished long ago. They would talk, sharing their stories, the quiet horrors of their pasts. In a world designed to be loveless, they found a connection, a mutual respect that slowly blossomed into something more. It wasn't easy. For her to be with him, she had to get a ticket of leave and the permission of the governor. Eventually, they got their wish. Eleanor was free of her service, and she and Thomas married. She left the officer's hut for the simple wattle and daub hut Thomas had built on his farm. It was nothing grand, just a couple of rooms with an earth floor, but to her, it was a palace. It was a home. For the first time since she was a girl in Dublin, she had a space that was truly hers. Perhaps that was the moment her life truly began again, not when she stepped off the ship, but when she stepped over the threshold of that simple hut as a free woman, with a man she had chosen. Together, they made that farm work. Eleanor was no stranger to hard yakka. Her skills were as valuable as his. They were a team, a true partnership, and soon their small hut was filled with the sound of children. Currency kids, born free in this new land. These women, who the system had treated as little more than breeding stock to populate the colony, became the matriarchs of a new nation. They raised the first generation of true Australians. They passed on their resilience, their grit, their stories of survival. They taught their children to be tough, to be resourceful, and to never, ever let anyone look down on them. The contribution of these convict women is the great, unsung story of Australia's foundation. They weren't just founding mothers, in a biological sense. They were the social glue that began to turn a brutal prison camp into a functioning society. They started the first small businesses, ran the first pubs, established schools, and cared for the sick and orphaned. They brought a measure of stability and normalcy to a place that had none. Despite being devalued and exploited by the system, they refused to be broken by it. They seized what little agency they could, made lives for themselves, and in doing so, shaped the character of our country in ways we are only now beginning to fully appreciate. So when we think about the story of Australia, let's not forget Eleanor and the 25,000 other women like her who were sent here in chains. They weren't saints. They were flawed, tough, and complex human beings who did what they had to do to survive. Their legacy isn't written in grand monuments or history books. It's written into the DNA of countless Australian families. It lives on in the spirit of the Aussie battler, in our national sense of a fair go, and in the quiet strength that has seen this country through its toughest times. They were the forgotten founders, and their story of resilience against all odds is perhaps the most Australian story of them all.